Yeah,
Oh, absolutely,
And then they
absolutely.
go home and
educating the
contaminate
world.
their
Yeah.
families and
Yeah.
friends.
Used to have
Workplaces.
the
They take
TV.
the class.
You had a channel on what was it, cable
In
TV or
Vermont,
something like that.
Cannabis Cable Network.
Hey, Bob was
Nice.
3.
But that we're going to resurrect now when I go back to Vermont. And one of the guys who I work with, he's from down in Florida,
No.
but he wants to syndicate it and put it on national cable. And he can make that happen.
Well, that's a hot topic now.
You got it.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I mean,
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
we should.
I should turn off my phone. Where is my phone?
I don't even know where I left my phone. I threw it maybe in my coat or something. I need to get away from it.
Yeah, right? Alright. Well, we got an hour before we run out of tape.
Sounds good.
I didn't want to start it until it was pertinent.
Right on.
Let the show begin.
So we're here at Dr. Bob's house. We're just hanging out. We're gonna have some casual conversation and see what we get into here. What are you up to these days, Dr.
What
Bob?
am I up to? Well, my big thing is I had been in the hospital for this cardiac problem I have, atrial fib that went wild.
Right, you tell me that, but by looking at you.
Well, very fortunately, things got fixed properly, and I must say, conventional meds are what did the trick because they brought my heart rate down from 168 resting to a more normal range.
Right.
Because when your heart's going like that, it can't fill up even. I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs, and now I'm able to run again and be normal
Nice.
as I am.
Nice, nice.
So as a result, I'm moving out of the Mile High area here in Colorado Springs, and I'm moving back to Vermont.
Richer oxygen land, huh?
Well, 350 feet above sea level as opposed to a mile.
Sure.
And one of my daughters is there, and my second ex-wife is there, and my grandkids and son-in-law, and lots of good friends. So I think it'll be fun. Well, they need a little more education back there. I've done my job here in Colorado.
Yeah, for sure.
We everybody knows who Dr. Malamud is here. Of course, we're going to go ahead and introduce everybody at the table. Laura, if you want to tell us a little bit about you, who you are, where you came from.
I'm Laura Daniel, and I'm from Montana.
Caregiver, grower,
Yeah, grower and caregiver and oil
maker, right on.
But you would never use it.
No,
you
I
know,
use it
we don't have
as
to
much
be,
as I
overly
can.
formal here. Jen here is my business partner, and of course the producer of Seed to Cure. This is a production for Seed to Cure. This is my beautiful wife, Christy here. So, let's talk about what you're teaching, University of Colorado. We just talked about that a few minutes
Well,
ago.
earlier today I taught my course on aging, but I do teach one of the only courses in the world, college-level courses, called endocannabinoids and medical marijuana. And I teach a course in immunology and DNA repair, and they all really center around inflammation and free radicals and how cannabinoids, in fact, are nature's way of dealing with that. And by nature's way, I mean we have an endocannabinoid system that's fundamental role really is to protect us, and it does so by regulating free radicals, which we produce by virtue of being alive. You need them. It's not like you don't want any, but you need them to be appropriately controlled. So in general, most people have historically viewed them from their damaging point of view because they react with everything. And in reacting with everything, you alter the function of important biological compounds like the DNA. It can cause mutations, although that's not one of the main things that it does. But nevertheless, they've got to be properly controlled because while on the one hand they have that damaging property, they also, by virtue of those damages, serve as signals so that the biochemistry can readjust itself so that it doesn't make too many. And the fact that we're burning fuel, typically being carbohydrates, but also very significantly being fats, there's different biochemistry involved in how and what you're burning. So where it becomes very critical is that when cells are burning sugar, they're promoting inflammation and free radical production. Whereas when they're burning fats, they inhibit that. And there's normally a dialogue, a biochemical dialogue that goes back and forth as the cell and or as an organism needs to adjust to what it's taking in, meaning the food, as well as just stimulation. The stimulation is going to create activity, and activity means you're burning something again. So you have to be able to do that in a way that minimizes harm to yourself. And that's so amazingly, interestingly, what the cannabinoid system has evolved to do. So, way back when vertebrates first emerged from, the evolutionary progress on the planet, that's when the endocannabinoid receptors first appeared. So prior to that, you had, going way back, you only had prokaryotic cells that could photosynthesize or eat hydrogen sulfide, chemosynthetic organisms. But as evolution proceeded, those organisms changed the planet. They made oxygen, and at the same time, after 1 billion years of dying, you had a lot of organic matter. And now you had oxygen that could burn the organic matter. So that provided a new evolutionary option, and that led to the development of more complicated cells called eukaryotic cells that had a true nucleus, eukaryote. And you started off with protozoa, amoeba, single-celled animals. And they do have the cannabinoid-like compounds, the lipid compounds. All of our cannabinoids, for the most part, there are exceptions, are lipids, fats. And but there were no receptors for them. They were part of kind of what I call the psychedelic swirl of our biochemistry. And with the development of the vertebrates, you had something new happening. So let me back up a second here. So your first cells were single-cellular cells.
Sure.
And then they started to work together a little bit. And the first multicellular organisms were sponges, porifera, they're called. And the next layer of evolution after that, the ball of cells, which already had limited differentiation, right? You have an inside and an outside, so that's going to create differences. But eventually you had an indent form in that ball, and that indent was an anus and a mouth. Not the most hygienic situation.
Nice.
So nature solved that problem by turning the indent into a tube. And the first organisms, first multicellular eukaryotic organisms that had that tube, when that tube developed embryologically, because we start off as a sperm and an egg, but eventually we get to be more than that, hopefully. When that tube first forms, in those first organisms that formed the tube formed head first. And they're called proteostomes. And today we have our insects and our lobsters and crustaceans that belong to that family. So they all embryologically open up that tube head first. And then you had a new evolutionary pathway occur, and that led to the development of vertebrates. And vertebrates are what's called deuterostomes. Not surprising when you think of our politicians and what goes on in the world. We form ass first.
Nice.
And some get stuck in that mode. But what's incredibly interesting is that with the development of the vertebrate lineage, what you had occurring also was the emergence of the CB1 receptor. And the CB1 receptor happens to be the one that once we reach the level where we had consciousness, that's the one that gets you high. But along the way, we also evolved the CB2 receptor, as well as a bunch of other receptors that are involved in that psychedelic biochemical swirl that are cannabinoid related, that deal with some of those entourage chemicals that all together create the whole. One of the real basics of life is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So things get more and more complex, and in doing that, you can't look at individual components. You got to look at how everything comes together. And ultimately, what is being selected for, as wisely pointed out by Darwin, a long time ago, was that we don't select for the biggest or the strongest or the smartest. What we select for is the most adaptable. And now when you look back at the difference between the proteostomes, the insects, the crustaceans, versus the deuterostomes, the vertebrates, and ultimately us, we have that adaptability. That incredible adaptability to the point that we even regulate our environment so that we don't have to be quite as adaptable. In other words, we don't have to. We're not swimming in a sewer waiting for some food to come by.
Right.
We can go to a store and buy what we want because we can plan ahead, because we have memories and the ability to adapt and change our way of thinking. And that's a key feature, and that key feature, interestingly, is provided to us by our cannabinoid system. So one of the characteristics, for example, of cannabis users is that they're optimistic. Well, what does optimism mean? It means that you embrace change. You don't know what the future is going to hold, but you feel positive that you're going to adapt to it. Whereas just an intrinsic truth is that half the population is going to be below average in any particular trait, and the other half is going to be above average. So we have evolved these endocannabinoids and the receptors that literally regulate everything in your body from conception till death. So our immune system, digestive system, cardiovascular system, skin, bones, all of that, our endocrine system, everything is regulated by the pot that we make. So with that as a foundation, how could we ever make cannabis illegal when basically our bodies have been designed to use it and have progressed in evolutionary time by the ability that the cannabinoids provide us to be adaptable. On the one hand, they give us the food, hungry, munchies, so we have the energy that we need. But on the other hand, it gives us the plasticity in our mind, in our immune system, in our skin. Think of like a lobster. He can't grow new skin. He's got to shed his skin, or an insect, right? Whereas if we, eat too much and get fatter, we expand our skin, or we expand our muscles, or we get thicker bones, or whatever we need to move on with whoever we are is facilitated by how the cannabinoid system regulates everything from conception till death. So you can take the straightest, most moronic prosecutor, like the ones we have here in Colorado Springs, and they can't adapt mentally to the reality of what we now know with modern science because they're cannabinoid deficient. Change is stress for them. So half the population, any change is going to be stressful. They want to avoid change. So how do you avoid change? You try to prevent anything new from happening. And you try to maintain the status quo.
One of the things, I want to back up 1 second. You mentioned the lipids in the evolution process, and we we know that with the vertebrates come the endocannabinoid system.
Well, the receptors.
The receptors,
See, we already
the
had
CB1,
the
and
ligands.
then later the CB2.
Yes.
Okay, but you mentioned the lipids and the fats, and we know that that's one of the main players that go along with the endocannabinoid system. And you mentioned at the single cell or at the amoeba stage or something. At that stage, there was something with lipids.
They already had those chemicals. Anandamide has been found in protozoa.
Now, what kind of a role is that playing in the development of the endocannabinoid system, or more importantly, with the endocannabinoid system that we have today?
Well, again, from my perspective, we have to be protecting against excess free radical production. And there are a series of biochemical swirls that deal with trying to do that. And so normally when you're processing carbohydrates, you do it through specialized organelles called mitochondria. And those mitochondria make ATP, which is our main currency for energy, so to speak. And in the process, that's when you make free radicals. There are other ways that we make them, but that's certainly the main way. We make approximately 2 kilograms a year of a particular free radical called superoxide. And what's important for people to realize is that one single molecule can kill you. A single free radical, for example, could interact with your DNA in a critical gene that's controlling cell division so that you no longer have control of cell division, which means cancer. And then your immune system may not be able to deal with it. And if you have brains and you try to use even cannabis, it may not be able to deal with it.
Sure.
So a single molecule can kill you. And we make
it's a lottery every day.
Well, we have something like 10 trillion cells, or I forget the number. It's something like 10 trillion cells. And every one of those cells every day makes, it's estimated, 10,000 DNA damages. And only one molecule in the wrong place at the wrong time can kill you. because it
Sure.
amplifies through the system, you know?
Right.
So our cannabinoids help to minimize that. They're one of multiple biochemical swirls that are trying to keep us alive. And the more we do, the more complexity we have biochemically, and the more complexity you have, the more energy you need to maintain it. So the more of that complexity has to be devoted to protecting you from being. And now that we understand to some degree what's going on, it turns out quite miraculously, and certainly thanks to Rick Simpson with his discovery that high-dose cannabis oil can actually kill cancer cells. And again, it should be emphasized, doesn't kill all of them and cure everybody all the time. But many people, we've now thousands of people all around the world, have basically cured themselves by using cannabis oil. And the science supports that very much so, despite the fact that a lot of the people involved in the science suffer from cannabinoid deficiency and are not open-minded enough to see what's right in front of their face.
Sure, and they label it all as anecdotal evidence, whether it's under medical care and whether there's all the obvious tests and results and so on and so forth. It doesn't seem to matter.
Well, you got to remember that.
No, we do have more and more doctors that are paying attention and jumping on board and
Yes.
even suggesting. But I think there's a lot of fear that controls most of the doctors.
Well, you got to remember, doctors, first of all, are not educated about this system. This past summer, a study was done, a survey of medical schools. And out of, I think it was 156 medical schools in the U.S., the word endocannabinoid is mentioned in 13% of the schools. Now, to show how totally insane that is, you've got to remember that the number one neurotransmitter in our brain, number one neurotransmitter system, is our cannabinoid system. So our doctors are not being educated about fundamental aspects, just looking at the nervous system. But a lot of our immune system is completely controlled by, again, our endocannabinoids, as is our bone development and our skin development. And, you see a lot of old-time cannabis users like myself. I still got dark hair. I'm 66 years old. But I've suffered terribly by using cannabis for 50 years now. And obviously it's affected my
It's
mind,
destroyed your life,
Oh, yeah.
obviously. And
Yeah.
Mine as well.
We always worry about the children. Well, I was one of those children, and for me, it made my life so much better and turned me on to education and learning.
I have a question from there. You were just talking about how the doctors aren't taught about this. Who takes your classes? What kind of people take your class?
Well, a lot of the better students at the University of Colorado here at Colorado Springs, the ones who will become doctors.
Okay.
and
That's what I'm wondering, if it's
scientists. So
people that
we
are in
are-
the medical
are any of
field or the science field. That's, I don't want to say, is it just young stoner kids that want to
No,
find out
no,
about
no, no.
marijuana, or is it, more of the medical professionals?
It's
That's what I
all
was
of the
curious.
above, but because a lot of the medical profession are stoners. If you look at medical schools or law schools, there's a greater percentage of those students using cannabis than in our colleges. And in our colleges, there's a greater percentage than using it in high schools, and a greater percentage in high schools than in kindergarten. So as we get smarter, those who are endowed enough to be open-minded and to try something different, rather than being too afraid to try anything, those are the ones who are going to enjoy cannabis. And it's really as a result of that dichotomy, that difference between the cannabinoid-endowed people, who I call flips, forward-looking people, versus the blips, the backward-looking people, who are, they're fearful. They don't have enough cannabis to be mellowed out about the stress of change. I believe, and everybody that I tell this to tends to like it, that our government and our world is run by blips, the backward-looking cannabis-deficient people, because they're trying to maintain stability, which is a good thing in a sense. You don't want economic chaos and political chaos, but they do it to such an extent that what they're really trying to do is protect themselves from the stress of change. And as a result, look back in history, the history of humanity. We've had, Genghis Khan and Mao Zedong and, Hitler and Stalin and George Bush or Cheney. We've had people who are aggressive, uptight, angry. Bush was more controlled by Cheney. So let's focus more on Cheney. Bush was probably more of an innocent bystander, I think. But you have these other people who just are so fearful and angry that they have to control everything, because by controlling things, you don't have change, right? You're controlling the change. So you're basically keeping it within the boundaries that you're comfortable with. Whereas evolution keeps discovering new things and new ways of being. And we have, technological revolutions constantly occurring as we learn more. An iPhone. We're not sitting there, I remember the old dial phones and, this kind of phone. Some of those were actually in stores still when I was a kid, the old speakeasy phones. So we've made tremendous changes, and we only do that by embracing change. So the world, in my opinion today, if we are to survive as a species, humanity, we have to replace the blips, the backward-looking people, the angry, uptight people that run the world, greedy, fearful, with people who are more cooperative, because cooperativity is the nature of life. That's how evolution occurs, by cells cooperating. That's how you generate more complexity. So it's such a kind of paradox that which has created us is minimized by its own creation, in the sense that these backward-looking people are controlling the world. And with man's impact on his environment, and just today there was a lot of comment coming out based on the UN report about global weather change. Whether it be only man-induced or not is not necessarily the point. The point is it's happening. And either we deal with it by minimizing it because of man's contribution, or we deal with it as well by being prepared. The old Boy Scout motto, be prepared. We've got to deal with reality, whereas if we choose to ignore change and make believe it's not happening, then in the end, we're going to promote our own demise. And you've got to realize that most species that have ever existed on the earth are now extinct. So do we want to go down that path? And do we have an option? And certainly if we have an option, it's got to be a manifestation of our intelligence, our ability to self-reflect as to what we're doing and how we're doing it, and how we in turn can turn things around so we can promote our survival rather than our death. So what we've seen occurring evolutionarily is a continuous increase in the use of cannabinoids biochemically. And we've now reached the point where we've gotten smart enough to know that we don't have to wait for evolution to change us. We can go grow some cannabis and start to cure ourselves in non-toxic fashions. We can promote and utilize the anti-aging properties of cannabinoids to better everyone and move forward in concert with the evolutionary forces, regardless of what God you believe in. For me, God is generalized open system dynamics. GOD. It's the physics of this creative process that I'm talking about. And if there's a more conventional God, well, this is how God, be it he or she or it, has made things work. So increased cannabinoid activity is part of the plan. However, whatever plan we're talking about here,
Sure.
this is reality.
Well,
Let's embrace it.
One of the things we recognized early on, especially once we started making cannabis oil, was much beyond the physical effect and the very obvious physical effects that were extreme, and we'll get into some of that later. But what I want to talk more about now is the mental ride and the spiritual changes that we witnessed and experienced ourselves.
Yep.
It was much more than the obvious camaraderie of some buddies getting together and smoking a few joints together. And there's a lot to be said about that. But I believe once you concentrate that oil and start witnessing some of the miracles that you can see, obviously, in the physical world, you can't deny the mental and spiritual change that takes place and the rippling out effect of that. And I think it's with each individual case and that ripple out effect that we even begin to stand a chance as a species, or even move forward with the potential for not just marijuana or cannabis, but all natural treatments. And with that being stated, I guess what kind of potential do you see with natural medicine, not just including cannabis, and modern medicine, which we just touched on a little bit, saved your life just a few weeks ago.
Absolutely.
You know, it's hard to, you certainly can't deny the advancements there, you know, but the potential of them two married together, you know, everybody wants to know what's your success rate against cancer, what's your success rate against this, that, or the other. And I'm not the guy that's going to try to put a number on that, and I'm not going to ask you to. But I am asking, what do you see as a potential, once we marry these things two together, and as you put it, reflect back on what we can really accomplish with an open mind and you know, the forward thinking?
Well, let's look for a second just at cannabis. You know, with modern biotechniques, you can make what's called a knockout mouse, where you can eliminate a gene in a strain of mice. So you can eliminate, for example, the CB1 receptor, the one that's the main neurotransmitter part of the main system in your brain there. And those mice absolutely cannot get high. You know, they're the DEA's dream, right?
Sure.
DEA, by the way, is an abbreviation for death, right? You think
Oh.
take away that TH, you know, and you got DEA. But in any event, if you make those knockout mice, what you find is that they die prematurely and that they're very stressed. They don't want to move. Well, doesn't that tell you something? That you
Yeah.
don't want to be cannabinoid deficient like
Yeah.
that? And then on the other side of that fence, you know, because the government was always trying to show how bad and dangerous cannabis is, back in the late 90s, they had done experiments where they fed mice and rats high quantities of THC. They basically force-fed them THC. And in quantities that we're using today to treat people with cancers. And so it's comparable to that level, which is extreme, you know, but hey, it beats cancer, it's good. And what they found, and they never published the study originally, it wasn't released, what they found was that the mice lived longer and had fewer tumors. So here they did an experiment to see the effects of this, you know, treatment, but instead of saying, well, it looks like the use of these high-dose cannabis was beneficial, instead they said, well, we think it's because they lost weight and they were thinner, that's why they benefited. You know,
Sure.
not looking at what's right in front of your eyes. There was an example of that the other day that kind of blew my mind again. On the recent Sanjay Gupta, the second episode that he had, they had a neurologist commenting on the kids who are using the high CBD oil to control their epileptic seizures. And his comment was, yeah, but we have to really be concerned about what we don't know that this drug might be doing. Well, you have kids who are having hundreds of seizures a day, who are going to, you know, 0 or 1 or 2 a week, and you're voicing your concern about using the drug that made that possible? What's the alternative? Let them just seize for the rest of their limited life?
And if it was any other substance, or if it came out of a pharmaceutical, it'd be a miracle.
Yeah,
It'd
I mean,
be,
this is retarded
well,
speaking.
to be blunt, if they could make $1 billion on it, it'd
Exactly.
be the best thing since
But when
sliced
you,
bread.
you know, to answer the question further, when you go back and look at herbal medicines, for example, many of the herbal medicines contain these related compounds, these flavonoids and other plant materials that are in many respects part of what we call the entourage effect in you know, how cannabis does what it does, which is why the plant works better than isolated THC, which is horrible, a horrible drug, pure THC.
Gotta get some face time.
You know?
Yeah, there he is. There you go. There. Yeah,
You know,
you
people
just,
have been having remarkable results with treating tumors in dogs.
I was actually written up on the Huffington Post for my tumor dog.
All
thing.
right.
Yeah.
Tell
Yeah.
us about it.
Well, yeah, I actually had made some green dragon tincture, and it was just the worst thing ever to drink. And so a friend kind of had told me to cook it down, so I ended up making oil. And then my dog had like a tumor on his face. We had already had one removed from his leg, but he had one on his face. And so I just started putting it on his face, and then he was eating it too. And it just came right out. Like, it was the most amazing thing. Like, I really wish I would have filmed the
Why
out part.
didn't you?
Oh, I was so mad.
What did it look like? I mean, everybody wants to know.
Oh, it was amazing. Like, it was so amazing how it happened. Like, when you put the oil on, you would think, like, it's burning a tumor off, or it's, like, making it fall off or whatever. But, like, you would put it on the skin, and the skin kept getting like pinker and like fresher and younger, and then all of a sudden, like, there was this black dot down it, and it was like it was killing it or something. And then he had went outside and like rolled in the dirt, and so all this blood had came out. And so he was sitting on the bed, and I could see like this little white thing peeking out. And I was just like sitting there, so I like started pushing on it, and like it just exploded like everywhere. But I wish I could have had it on YouTube. It was so
Nice.
awesome. It was like so satisfying because like what came out was like this hunk of like bits and like all this stuff. But he was so happy about it.
Chunks, and pieces.
But it came. It was so fast.
Well, you know what seems to be
Absolutely
true, and you know you have to be cautious about things. 'Cause we haven't done things in a proper controlled fashion. You know, the cannabis world is exploding with citizen scientists who are all
Yeah, with a jar of green
Yeah.
dragon
I don't
that's like
know what you
smearing
mean.
it. My mother-in-law was like horrified. We were driving around with my dog with like this green paste on this huge tumor forever, and my poor cute little mother-in-law. People would be like, "What is that?" And she'd be like, "It's cannabis oil. We're treating his cancer." And he's just got like this
God
green
bless her.
gob on his face.
My girlfriend was like that when she treated her skin cancer. You know, they wanted to do Mohs procedure, and you know she was an attractive young lady and had avoided it because she had other ones done in other places, and they scar you, etc.
Yeah.
And in this case, they wanted to peel away half of her face to get at that tumor. So we put the oils on it, and then a couple of months later, she wound up going to the doctor and having it all checked out. And I remember calling her up because she was in Australia. Calling her up, and she was crying. And I said, "Oh, crap, it didn't work, you know."
Yeah.
And she says, "No, these are tears of joy. It's gone. But I have another one on my nose."
Oh.
So we did it all over again, and of course that one went away. And, you know, people who use cannabis, even though it's not been done in a proper clinical trials, double-blinded studies, blah, 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 if you have multiple tumors either at one time or repeatedly occurring, and you put it on and they go away, and you do it again, it goes away. It goes, you know, you'd be an idiot not to believe it's working.
Not a whole lot
Right.
of
And it-
science
well, and it-
involved. It worked, right?
And especially in cases of skin cancer. I mean, it's in your face, it's obvious. And there's
Yeah.
plenty of cases that do have the photographic evidence,
Yep.
medical evidence, and so on and so forth. In skin cancer, I mean, it's kind of like blood pressure, blood sugar, this. I mean, you can take a picture of it. You can look at it. There's no denying it. It's either
Well, there
there or
is
it's
denying
not.
it. Doctors have denied it. We've had oncologists who refuse to look at pictures that document that. It's not that they would look at it and say, "I don't believe." They wouldn't even look at it. Now that's mental illness. These are clearly examples of blips.
It is. It
You know,
is.
it would upset their world too much to be able to readjust to the reality that cannabis can kill cancers.
That's crazy.
You know, and I guess that addresses the question that I get all the time. Well, why, if it's so effective, or if it's so, you know, so
If
little,
it works,
you know,
why
there's
isn't
no
my
harmful
doctor telling me
effects,
about it?
very few negative effects from cannabis treatment. You know, and there's a ton of success stories out there. Why aren't more doctors doing it? Why aren't they talking
Because
about
they're
it?
not
Why
taught
would-
it.
You know, and I think you just hit the nail on the head. You know, that would rock their world so hard to be able to have to accept that reality that it'd be like more than changing religions for these people. You know?
We have those screaming monkeys.
The dog loves the screaming monkey.
We have those
Well, you
screaming
gotta
monkeys.
get the screaming
3 of
monkeys.
them.
I mean,
You could probably
So,
barely
how
hear
could
it.
you get it to be taught in medical schools? Like, could you
Well, you
change
have-
the standards in some
Yeah,
way?
but the professors that are teaching in medical school
Yeah.
don't know it.
Yeah. So is there
No,
like
but
a
they're-
board of curriculum or
Well, no,
like
they're
a?
starting to learn it. It just takes a while for
So-
knowledge to disseminate.
Mhm.
But, you know, the thought that you hear all the time, "Oh, we don't have enough science." You don't have enough science because you haven't bothered to read the literature. You take somebody like Sanjay Gupta, who is obviously a flip. He's an open-minded person. I sent him thousands of references, and he obviously looked into enough of it, either from the ones I sent him or on his own, doesn't matter.
That's awesome.
He was
that you
able
sent
to
him
absorb new
thousands.
knowledge, change his mind, and what was the consequence? He apologized to the people
That's
that
so
he had
awesome.
not done the right thing. Now, you know, how many of our professors that are teaching in college or medical school have gone and taken that extra step to go and look at the literature? On my computer, I've got 12,000 peer-reviewed articles on cannabinoids doing all the magical things they do. I got 900 and something just showing cannabinoids killing cancer. Now, out of that 900, there's about 5 that show that it stimulated tumor growth. But 945 of them show the opposite.
Well, and there's a lifetime of reading and evidence there for any education level as well. From all the way to the advanced stuff that your average Joe's not going to understand a lick of, to your everyday anecdotal type YouTube videos. You don't have to be able to read words this long to be able to see, to watch a video for crying in a bucket, and to see things like skin cancer go away, or see diabetics that are no longer dependent on insulin, or, and so on and so forth. And, is there anything, what doesn't the endocannabinoid system regulate or influence?
Well, it regulates everything.
Is it every part of the body, every mammal?
It does seem to regulate everything because it regulates every one of our body systems. But that doesn't always mean that it's regulating it in a positive way.
Okay.
So, for example, if you look at the liver and fibrosis, which is a problem, a lot of the experiments were done showed that CB1 activation stimulates fibrosis. But on the other hand, when you use cannabis, especially when you use higher doses, that seems to stimulate more of the conversion to the CB2 receptor, which, let me go back to your earlier question, herbs and things. Many of the herbs that are used medicinally or just used as food substances happen to regulate, mimic cannabinoids in different ways.
Okay.
So things like beta-caryophyllene, which is found in a number of different herbs, actually stimulates the CB2 receptor, which stimulates fat burning, which is a way of protecting against the free radical damage created by too much CB1 stimulation. So you need a balance between CB1 and CB2, depending on the illness and the condition. The United States government has a patent on the neuroprotective properties of THC, which occur largely through the CB1 receptor. So you protect your brain by using cannabis.
But isn't that what grows the tumors?
Pardon me?
Didn't you say if you overstimulate, then the tumors
It
grow?
depends on the type of tumor.
So technically, like if Big Pharma does separate out all these cannabinoids, there is the possibility that you could get like tumor growth or some sort of bad
Same
something
is true
that
by
could
using
happen.
cannabis. It depends on how much you're
Yeah.
using. Low doses.
But maybe with whole plant therapies, maybe it wouldn't be as apt to happen than if in like a lab you separated it
Well,
out.
yeah, well, if you have, because there are all sorts of synthetic cannabinoids. And generally you have 3 kinds of cannabinoids. Endocannabinoids that we make, and by the way, we make them from essential fatty acids like omega-3 fatty acids. You go to any doctor, they'll tell you, oh yeah, take fish oil, they're good for you. Why are they good for you? Because your body makes pot out of it.
So technically,
know
we
that.
could trick.
Nice.
So technically, we could trick the blips into making their own pot by giving them essential fatty acids, though, right?
You
So
can.
if we just run around giving them fish oil, we can trick them into making
But
it,
there's
and then
only a
maybe they'll want
limit.
to eat it.
There's a limit to how much you can make.
Okay.
Your body has a range, so you can make a certain amount of endocannabinoids.
Okay.
And there have been a number of studies where they've looked at omega-3s for blood thinning, for antidepressant activity, for anti-pain activity, all the things that pot does. They've looked at whether or not omega-3s do it. And in fact, they seem to do it in many of these cases. But of course, it's how do you patent then fish oil?
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
So you go back to the pharmaceuticals, they want to make the single individual, what we call agonists or antagonists, depending on whether you want to turn on or turn off the various cannabinoids. And different herbs will have the capacity to do either. For example, curcumin, coming from turmeric. In India, where they use that very frequently, there's a very low incidence of colon cancer.
Yeah, that's what I have in my acetylcholine.
And it turns out that stimulating CB1, in fact, inhibits colon cancer. We had a patient here in Colorado. He was stage 4 colon cancer, and he went on the cannabis therapy, and he literally crapped out his tumor, and it's tumor-free. The body likes to expel it when it can.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about a skin cancer, or if you're talking about inside the tube,
Yeah.
throat potentially, but certainly stomach, esophageal, stomach, and colon cancer, we've seen both with stomach and colon cancers, people who literally defecated their tumor.
That'd be so awesome. That'd be amazing.
Only the farm girl. But absolutely, what better? I mean, you've got cancer to know that your tumor
You
is
just
gone.
crop
I
it
mean,
out.
you know,
You'd be like, yes.
and we've even seen cases, and I haven't seen it firsthand, but I've seen and talked to people that have choked and puked their tumor up right out of their mouth, you know, from the lung, and coming out in their right out their ass, you know, through the skin. That I've seen myself. You know, it's
I've done it.
beyond amazing and undeniable. I mean, you know, and on the other side of that, there's certainly people that find that it has little to no effect on their cancer or their tumors, you know,
Yes.
or their diabetes or
I think he
whatever
has to go
condition
out.
he might be
Okay.
suffering.
But I have to watch
Yeah, we
him.
can take a break
Otherwise
for a
he'll run
minute.
away.
Take a break.
Otherwise he'll run away.
Absolutely.
That's
Go
funny
ahead,
that
go
the
do-
fish oil
go.
does it. We started making my mother-in-law take krill oil. Now she can make her own pot.
Go.
Oh. It's just real hard to get them talking, you know.
We're down to 20 minutes.